After the abolition of slavery, social moralists had decided to move on to two more major issues: Mormon polygamy and the prohibition of alcohol. Polygamy was easily able to get rid of due to the overtly Protestant nature of the US at the time. Alcohol was a bit harder. However, with family violence brought on by alcohol, the saloon-based political corruption, and alcoholism faced in the US, it was a movement that was starting to pick up momentum. The next logical step was to translate it into political action, and as such, in 1869, the Prohibition Party was born. The party's number one issue was, of course, prohibition. However, while prohibition was not exclusively right or left, there were many people from both sides of the aisle that argued for prohibition. The party approached prohibition from a conservative viewpoint. The party did, however, adopt one major progressive platform plank: giving women the right to vote, giving women full delegate rights at an 1872 presidential convention, where they nominated prohibition activist and founding member James Black to be their nominee, and the first party chairman, John Russell, to be their running mate. They managed to get 5,607 votes. The reason for their lower voter turnout, despite the fact that prohibition was slowly rising in popularity, was the fact that many prohibition advocacy groups, like the Anti-Saloon League, did not support third parties. 4 years later, at their second convention, they nominated former Representative and Governor Green Clay Smith to be their nominee, and lawyer Gideon T. Stewart as the running mate. Then ended up getting 6,945 votes. By 1880, the Prohibition Party had made a steady rise as prohibition became a more pressing issue in the era, and they were getting more high-profile support for the party. 1880 was the first to make it known by having the party nominate former mayor of Portland, Maine, Neil Dowell, to be their candidate, and Professor Henry Adams Thompson to be his running mate, both of whom were known for being former Republicans who left the GOP because they would not go far enough in regards to prohibition. The thing is, unlike the previous tickets, Dow didn't really focus on the presidential election, instead choosing to focus on campaigning for down-the-ballot prohibition candidates in Maine. Despite this lack of campaigning, the GOP begged Dow to drop out of the race in fear that he may spoil the election against them. Dow refused and ultimately got 0.11% of the popular votes. And no, his presence didn't spoil the election at all. By 1884, the climb had gotten more noticeable when they nominated former governor of Kansas, John St. John, for president, and former Maryland state legislator, William Daniel, as his running mate. This campaign, unlike the previous ones, actually had the added bonus of being supported by larger prohibition groups and figures like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and Frances Willard, which made the party's support grow to 1.5% of the popular vote. He was accused of being a spoiler due to the fact that his vote total in New York was larger than the vote margin between the two major candidates, and New York could have swayed the election. Though New York wasn't a consistent swing state at the time, so there really wasn't any worry. Later in 1888, they nominated senior officer during Reconstruction, Clinton B. Fisk, for president, and religious scholar John A. Brooks to be his running mate. Like the previous two elections, the spoiler accusations was thrown out at him. Despite this, he managed to get 2.2% of the popular votes. During the 1892 election, there was a bit of an interesting development. You see, the People's Party was in full force, and they aimed for a similar but different group of rural voters than the Prohibition Party. Due to that, there were actually talks with the two parties merging together into one, and they were actually relatively close to doing so, but some more radical members of the Prohibition Party were not keen on watering down the prohibition message by adopting populist rhetoric. Plus, the Prohibition Party convention was held in Cincinnati, so when the Southern populists sent their mostly black delegates, they were turned away. So yeah, that plan flopped, but nevertheless, they kept trucking along. There were 3 candidates who sought the nomination of the Prohibition Party: Party Chairman Gideon T. Stewart, magazine editor and former NYC mayoral candidate William Jennings Demhurst, and former California Representative John Bidwell. It was expected that the race would be a close one between Bidwell and Demhurst, but it was actually the New York delegation that gave Bidwell the nomination. The VP nomination was also highly contested between religious pastor James B. Cranfill and Baptist figure Joshua Levering. Cranfill ended up becoming the running mate. Bidwell's last run for public office was while affiliated with the Anti-Monopoly Party, so there was obviously still a bit of attempt to appeal to populists. The ticket ended up getting 2.24% of the popular vote. Spoiler alert, this was the highest amount of votes and percentage that the party got. With that vote total under their belt, the Prohibition Party was reinvigorated to push themselves further than they have ever gone before. However, there was an issue on how to do so. Some members, led by John St. John and Reverend Charles Bentley, dubbed the Broad Gaugers, wanted to expand the Prohibition Party platform to include free silver and women's suffrage. Wait, I thought they were already in favor of women's suffrage. I guess at one point the Prohibition issue kind of took precedent over everything else. Another faction, led by Joshua Levering and Professor Samuel Dinkle, called the Narrow Gaugers, wanted to keep the platform to just no alcohol allowed. Both factions ran a candidate to represent them in the Prohibition Party primary, Bentley and Levering respectively. The infighting had gotten so bad that even when the Narrow Gaugers were actually considering giving some concessions to the Broad Gaugers were already considering yeeting off to form a new political party. Since the Narrow Gaugers were the ones who were in charge of the party, Levering ended up being the nominee, with attorney Hale Johnson being selected as his running mate. The Broad Gaugers then walked out and started another political party called the National Prohibition Party, mimicking the Democrats' fracturing at the moment. They nominated Charles Bentley for president and NC State Party Chairman James Southgate to be his running mate. The Levering ticket got 0.94% of the popular vote, while the Bentley ticket got 0.1% of the popular vote. It's now the 20th century, so maybe it's time for the Prohibitionists to put the pedal to the metal and finally get some major wins. The first major win came from the National Prohibition Party merging back to the OG Prohibition Party. As a concession/olive branch, the party had adopted some progressivism to the platform. Now that that's out of the way, let's go on to the nomination process. 3 people sought the Prohibition Party nomination: 1896 VP Hale Johnson, Methodist preacher Silas Swallow, and lawyer John G. Woolley. However, right before the balloting began, Johnson dropped out of the race. Woolley ended up being the nominee, and former gubernatorial candidate Henry B. Metcalf was nominated to be his running mate. They ultimately got 1.51% of the popular vote. Later in the 1904 election, the Prohibition Party was paying attention to the Democratic Party's nomination process as they were on their way to nominating Commanding General of the U.S. Army Nelson A. Miles for president. However, 1 hour before the convention, Miles sent them a telegram saying that he would not accept the Prohibition Party nomination, so they ended up nominating Silas Swallow for president and businessman George Washington Carroll as his running mate. Swallow almost declined the nomination due to his wife's declining health, but she started to get better, so he went on the campaign trail. They ended up getting 1.92% of the popular vote. In 1908, there was a growth in third-party activity. Socialist Labor Party, Middle Populists, Independence Party, Socialist Party, and of course, the Prohibition Party. The Prohibition Party had nominated prominent party politician and judge Eugene W. Chafin for president and Minister Aaron S. Watkins as his running mate. Chafin was well known for making many speeches decrying the consumption of alcohol and enforcing local prohibition laws in Waukesha, Wisconsin. His campaign called for the prohibition of alcohol, no duh, but he also called for women's suffrage, enforcement of anti-prostitution laws, tougher restrictions on divorce, regulation of tobacco products, and the federal ban of child labor. They ultimately got 1.71% of the popular vote. Now on to the 1912 election, which we all know is a doozy. Chafin and Watkins were easily renominated for their positions, and they got to work. While Chafin did not participate in the big boys fighting amongst each other, he instead focused on doubling the campaign efforts of the Prohibition Party. During the campaign, Chafin delivered 538 speeches in 14 weeks, sometimes doing 5 a day. One speech, he expressed amazement that the U.S. would wage a civil war over chattel slavery, but would not lift a finger over the bondage alcohol had over the U.S. They ended up getting 1.38% of the popular vote. In the 1914 midterms, the Prohibition Party had its first major victory when Prohibition Party candidate Charles Hiram Randall was elected to California's 9th Congressional District. This was the final push for the Prohibition Party to go into overdrive. The party convinced itself they were going to do well in the next presidential election and were possibly going to win. So the party went ahead and nominated Indiana Governor Frank Hanley to be their candidate and Minister Ira Landreth as his running mate. Hanley's gubernatorial tenure was well known for causing 72 of Indiana's counties to ban all sales of liquor and setting up Flying Squadron of America, a temperance organization that staged nationwide speaking tours. Their ticket ended up getting 1.19% of the popular vote. Meanwhile, in the same election time frame, Sidney Johnson Katz was elected governor of Florida as a prohibitionist, though he was still a registered Democrat during and after his tenure. And it looks like all of their hard work was about to pay off. Now, while the party itself had minor successes in electing people, their speaking tours and political lobbying was finally paying off, because on October 28, 1919, the National Prohibition Act, which came right out of the Anti-Saloon League and would go into effect January of 1920. So yeah, Prohibition is now a thing. So what does the Prohibition Party do now? Now that the Prohibition Party's main issue was resolved, you'd think they'd disappear. But nope, they decided that it would be best to move the goalpost and focus on campaigning on stricter national enforcement of Prohibition, as opposed to the more localized enforcement of Prohibition by clergy groups and the KKK. The party went ahead and nominated two-time VP candidate Aaron Watkins for president and New York Senate candidate David Lee Coughlin as its running mate. Due to the fact that maintaining Prohibition was now kind of a Republican-held issue, considering the Republican Party candidate in this election actually voted for Prohibition, the Prohibition Party only got 0.71% of the popular vote. Meanwhile, Randall lost re-election at his House seat. In between then and 1924, the popularity of Prohibition was shifting. Not too much, but at least the two major parties were now seeing their dry and wet factions take over control of the parties. Democrats being slowly taken over by the wet faction, as in people who hated Prohibition, and the Republican Party slowly being taken over by the dry faction, as in Prohibitionists. But I mean, it wasn't too noticeable yet, at least on the Republican side, because this was the first election that the Democrats ran an openly anti-Prohibition candidacy. Coolidge didn't really talk about Prohibition at all, neither did Robert M. La Follette. So it's up to the Prohibition Party to be the sober voice in this election. The party ended up nominating former gubernatorial candidate Herman P. Ferris and key WCTU figure Marie C. Burm to be his running mate. Burm was notable for being the first woman on a presidential ticket that could actually vote for herself. Meanwhile, former Prohibitionist rep Charles Randall was nominated to be the VP candidate of Gilbert Nations of the anti-Catholic KKK-sponsored American Party. The Prohibitionists ended up getting 0.19% of the popular vote, while the American Party got a little under half of that. By the next election, the shift I had mentioned earlier started to become more noticeable. The dry Republicans had pretty much taken over the GOP, while the wet faction had fully dominated the Democratic Party. That made the Prohibition Party contemplate either not running a presidential candidate and endorsing Herbert Hoover's candidacy, or running New York Prohibitionist William F. Varney for the presidency. Varney won by a close margin, and in the VP nomination process, third-party political activist James A. Edgerton narrowly beat out Prohibition Party state rep Frank S. Reagan. The Prohibition Party and its candidates were not at all oblivious to the potential spoiler effect, so they took some extra precautions to try and diminish that. Edgerton wanted the ticket removed from any states that could be close in the presidential election. The California Prohibition Party outright refused to nominate the Varney-Edgerton ticket in favor of Hoover, and Varney ran a front porch campaign as opposed to an active campaign, the party ended up getting 0.05% of the popular vote. By 1930, it was evident that Prohibition wasn't working as well as Prohibitionists thought it would. Organized crime was going up, illegal alcohol trade was happening, and while poor people couldn't even get a pint of beer unless it was medicinal, rich people didn't at all get affected by Prohibition. The Prohibition Party argued that the rise of organized crime happened due to urbanization rather than alcohol being banned, and the solution was simply stricter prohibition. The majority of Americans now seemed attracted to the wet opposition's talk of personal liberty, new tax revenues from legal liquor, and the scourge of organized crime. Even Hoover started to pull back from Prohibition, which led the party chairman D. Colvin to say, "The Republican wet plank supporting the repeal of Prohibition means that Mr. Hoover is the most conspicuous turncoat since Benedict Arnold." So, as a sort of response to this, they couldn't simply nominate just a normal prohibitionist. They had to nominate the driest of dries. So the party nominated former Democratic Representative William David Upshaw for the presidency, and Frank Reagan was nominated to be his running mate. Then he ended up getting 0.21% of the popular vote. 1 year later, Roosevelt's administration ended Prohibition, which was a plus and a minus for the Prohibition Party. While their biggest major accomplishment fell, that just meant that the party could campaign on it again and become politically relevant again. By 1936, they were ready to try and bring back a better Prohibition era. Unfortunately, nobody really cared because they were focused on the New Deal or trying to bring a better solution to this. Despite this, the Prohibition Party nominated Chairman D. Colvin to be their candidate, and distinguished World War I soldier Sergeant York to be his running mate. York declined the nomination, so they nominated Minister Claude A. Watson to be his running mate. They ended up receiving 0.08% of the popular vote. Later in 1940, the Prohibition Party nominated entrepreneur Roger Babson as their candidate and livestock feed manufacturer Edgar Moorman to be his running mate. They ended up getting 0.12% of the popular vote. In between these two elections, the country got into World War II, and people in parties were divided on how to handle strategy in homeland and overseas. The Prohibition Party was like, "Nah, we just gotta ban liquor and everything will be fixed." Yeah, from my research, it apparently shows that they didn't really have much care for the war strategy, at least no statements I could find. They nominated Claude Watson to be their presidential nominee, and General Secretary of the American Temperance Society, Floyd C. Carrier, to be his running mate. Carrier later left the ticket due to health issues, and Minister Andrew N. Johnson was nominated as a replacement. During the campaign, Watson, who was a pilot, was denied permission to fly his plane across the U.S. because the war effort made the U.S. ban air flight that they didn't sanction. Reporters actually went to Roosevelt and questioned this decision, making it seem like he was doing this to specifically hinder Claude Watson's presidential ambitions, so Roosevelt later gave a special exception for Watson, who would later end up flying 16,000 miles simply campaigning. They ended up getting 0.16% of the popular vote. 4 years later, there were more interesting things that happened in the presidential election, but the Prohibition Party didn't get involved with all that drama, just simply focusing on moving forward. They renominated Claude Watson to be their nominee, and Prohibitionist politician Dale H. Learn was his running mate. There was one interesting thing that happened during the campaign, though. Claude actually sent his wife, Maud Hagen Watson, to the White House to measure the curtains and other interior furnishings, just in case. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Claude knew that sending his wife to measure the drapes was a premature stance of victory, as that was already a well-known political term at the time. He obviously did it just for publicity, but that is a big power move, to be honest. The Watson ticket ended up getting 0.21% of the popular vote, though that percentage did not include Claude and his wife, because his wife had misplaced their requested absentee ballots, and when they went to go cast their ballot in person, the ballot office said, "Sorry, you already requested absentee ballots, so if you want to vote now, you have to give us your absentee ballots." So yeah, I guess the power move was a little bit premature as well. Most people at this time were not seriously looking at the Prohibition Party as a viable political party anymore. That didn't stop the party from trying to rise back to its former glory, as like every other minor party at the time, it has its crowd. Their attempt this election cycle was to nominate singing cowboy Stuart Hamblin for the presidency and Prohibitionist perennial candidate Enoch A. Holtwick as his running mate. I mean, Hamblin was composing for John Wayne movies and was top of the charts at the time, so it was a decent strategy. They ended up getting 0.12% of the popular vote. 4 years later, two people sought the Prohibition Party nomination. Enoch Holtwick and 1952 American Vegetarian Party candidate Herbert Holdridge. I'll probably have to explain what the American Vegetarian Party is at a later date. The party ended up nominating Holtwick, and Holdridge was nominated to be their running mate. However, Holdridge was dropped from the ticket after they found out that he was distributing extremely anti-Eisenhower pamphlets at the floor of the Republican Party nominating convention, and leader Edwin M. Cooper was chosen as a replacement. They ended up getting 0.07% of the popular vote. In the 1960 election, the party went ahead and nominated former president of the National Association of Evangelicals, Rutherford Decker, to be their nominee, and party chairman E. Harold Munn was chosen to be their running mate. They ended up getting 0.07% of the popular vote. Now, of course, we can notice the sharp decline in vote totals for the Prohibition Party. Now we can debate on why that is. The important thing is, the Prohibition Party does not want that, so they need a strategy to resolve that. So their strategy was to nominate a figure that could vigorously campaign as if he were a major party candidate that actually had a chance of winning. Luckily, they had just the guy, chairman and former VP candidate E. Harold Munn, who himself stated of his campaign, quote, "It's a matter of standing for principles and what one believes in." Perennial Prohibitionist candidate Mark R. Shaw was nominated to be his running mate. Munn, as stated before, campaigned very aggressively in this election. He campaigned from coast to coast, making appearances in universities as well as TV and radio programs, boosting him even more. Many newspapers loaded his campaign, saying that it's too bad that there wasn't a sufficient organization to see him elected. Munn ended up getting 0.03% of the popular vote. Though his work did pay off a bit, as the party got on the ballot in more states and exit polls show that 1.46% of students voted for Munn. 1968 had the Prohibition Party overshadowed by other minor party candidates, but they still went ahead with campaigning. Munn was easily renominated, and evangelist Roland E. Fisher was chosen to be his running mate. They ended up receiving 0.02% of the popular vote, being beaten out by three parties formed that year and a guy who was being written in 2 states. 1972 wasn't much different. The party renominated Munn while electing a new chairman and choosing salesman Marshall E. Unkefer to be their VP. They ended up receiving 0.02% of the popular vote, again having a newly founded party beating them. As we can see, the decline is getting steeper and steeper for the Prohibition Party. Maybe they need to fix something about their party or strategy. Let's see what they thought would work. First came the 1976 election, where they nominated former Maine State Representative Benjamin Bubar for president and party chairman Earl Dodge as his running mate. Now, Bubar wanted to raise publicity for his campaign, but Dodge didn't want to take any risks. Their first strategy was to double the number of pages of the official party paper, the National Statesman, in order to sell advertising space, but Dodge said no. Ben then decided to get the services of a public relations firm, but Dodge again said no. So without either of those strategies, he had to campaign on one last campaign strategy. A simple can of Maine moose milk. I don't know how it would work and have no pictures to show it, but it is reported to have existed. They ended up receiving 0.02% of the popular vote. In 1977, the party decided that maybe it was their name that was making people hesitant to vote for them. So the party decided to change their name to the National Statesman Party for future elections, starting with 1980. The party went ahead and renominated Ben and Dodge for their ticket, despite the fact that these two didn't really see eye to eye that much. The ticket ended up receiving 7,206 votes. Later that year, the party then reinstituted the name, the Prohibition Party. Dodge later decided to start a business selling campaign memorabilia called Buttons for Dodge, which apparently went so well that it ended up helping the party financially. We'll put a pin in that for later. Before the election went underway, Earl Dodge suffered a mild heart attack. But if that's not a deterrent for major presidential candidates, why would that deter Dodge? As the Prohibition Party felt that he was the only person who could take the party forward, and as such, he was nominated to be their candidate for president. And parole officer / perennial prohibitionist candidate Warren C. Martin was nominated as his running mate. They ended up receiving 4,243 votes. Later in the 1988 election, Dodge was easily renominated by the Prohibition Party, and businessman George Ormsby was nominated to be his running mate. Dodge also participated in the Massachusetts Independence voter primary / debate. They ended up receiving 8,002 votes. Later in 1992, the party decided to go ahead and renominate the Dodge Ormsby ticket and ended up receiving 961 votes. Later in 1996, Dodge easily got renominated by the party, and Women's Christian Temperance Union President Rachel Bubar Kelly was chosen to be his running mate. Kelly was actually the sister of former presidential candidate Ben Bubar, and it looks like they got along better than Bubar and Dodge did. This ticket ended up receiving 1,298 votes. The 2000 election kept up with this little tradition by again renominating Dodge for president and also nominating retired aeronautical engineer Dean Watkins as his running mate. Watkins was the grandson of prominent party member Aaron S. Watkins. I don't blame you for getting. Look how far we are in the video at this point. Say what you want about the Prohibition Party, they have a very close and loyal base following them. Dodge also ended up seeking the nomination of the Independent American Party, a smaller paleo-conservative party. The ticket ended up receiving 208 votes. Before we get into the negatives, let me give you one major success for the Prohibition Party. In 2002, they elected James Hedges to the position of tax assessor for Thompson Township, Pennsylvania. It's a start to possibly something greater, so let's see what happens next. First, the party was having many internal struggles, all of which revolving around Earl Dodge. Remember Buttons for Dodge? Well, it turns out what was originally a side project that would help the party with some financial issues was seemingly Dodge's main focus now. That wasn't all. Turns out that Dodge was more likely using party funds for this and other personal endeavors, and when treasurer Earl Higgerson tried to look into the party's account books, Dodge refused, and when he asked about another financial endeavor called the National Prohibition Foundation, Dodge simply said it was none of your business. Dodge also claimed to need Prohibition Party funds to add an addition to his house that would be used as an office for the party. However, the funds were apparently used for a tool shed in the backyard. And to add salt in the wound, it turns out many of the campaign memorabilia he was selling on his website was stolen from his fellow party members. And to top it all off, Dodge held a meeting at his house, Prohibition Party office, and had declared himself the nominee of the Prohibition Party and Texas National Committeeman Howard Liddick to be his running mate without notifying or even flat out denying entry to party officials. However, James Hedges took charge and decided to take the majority of the party and hold a public meeting expelling Dodge from the party and nominating a ticket of minister and prohibition activist Gene Amundsen for president and law enforcement consultant Leroy Plenton as his running mate. Amundsen was very notable for his very blunt way of supporting prohibition, saying things like, quote, "I'm going to fight booze until hell freezes over. Then I'm going to go buy a pair of ice skates and fight it some more." Even going so far as to stand outside liquor stores dressed as the Grim Reaper. Now, originally, Dodge had stated that Amundsen had asked Dodge to be his running mate, but was denied the position, saying Gene was, quote, "probably a very nice man, but he may not have known exactly what he's getting into." Gene responded by saying Dodge was a good man, but, quote, "is not just getting the job done. He's too old. We need to send it to an earlier generation." Since Gene had the larger faction, he had a lot more appearances in the media, being interviewed by the likes of the Associated Press, where he said, I'd rather have 100 Al Capones in every city than alcohol sold in every grocery store. And Jon Stewart, where he said,
Drinking is really not for bright people. It cuts the supply of oxygen off to the brain, and that gives you kind of a retarded state.
Now, these two campaigns were not seen as two different campaigns, but rather which faction was stronger and could lead the party into the future. The Edmondson ticket got 1,944 votes, while the Dodge ticket got 140 votes. So yeah, I think we know who won this battle. Now, despite the overall failure of the Dodge faction, they went ahead and renominated Dodge for president in 2008. However, Dodge died of cardiac arrhythmia before the campaign officially went underway, so that pretty much reunified the Prohibition Party going into the 2008 election. The reunified party renominated Gene Edmondson for president and Leroy Pletton for VP, though Gene did say Newt Gingrich would be another good choice. Gene again focused his campaign on interviews, even using them to more refine his platform, such as supporting the war in Iraq, wanting to enact tougher immigration laws, protecting gun rights, and decreasing government welfare programs. Now, Edmondson said that winning was probably off the table, saying that third-party people do not win, but we say wise things, and when they did not, only getting 655 votes. Now, going into the election, Gene was seen as the perfect candidate for the party, but he died in 2009, so the room was open for the Prohibitionists to nominate a new candidate for the 2012 election. Two people ended up seeking the nomination: prominent party member James Hedges and perennial presidential candidate Jack Feller. Both of these two took different approaches to policy. Feller was a far-right conservative, while Hedges was a bit more Christian democratic in his thinking, being pro-environmentalism and even praising the idea of a UK healthcare system. Feller ended up receiving the nomination, and party chairman Toby Davis was nominated to be his running mate. Now, I've done a video about Jack Feller's presidential ambitions before, and there's not much else to say here except that he ended up receiving 518 votes. Later came the 2016 election, which we all know had that whole thing about nominating the two most unpopular main party presidential candidates in US history thing. So much like every other third party, Prohibition Party was all set on cashing in on that. The party nominated party chairman Greg Seltzer for president and James Hedges as his running mate. However, Governor of Maryland Larry Hogan appointed Seltzer to be a part of Maryland's election board. After that, Hedges was chosen to lead the new ticket, with businessman Bill Bays being chosen to be his running mate. Hedges also decided to seek the nomination of the American Independent Party, whose nomination he lost to Donald Trump. The Hedges-Bays ticket received 5,617 votes. Now, of course, we are in the midst of the 2020 election, and as we can tell from the video, they are not giving up now. 3 people actively sought the Prohibition Party nomination: Massachusetts Prohibition National Committee member Adam Seaman, who was running a centrist-style campaign that would tackle modern-day issues like net neutrality; perennial candidate Phil Collins, running as a moderate conservative; and 2016 VP candidate Bill Bays, running as your average paleocon-like prohibitionist. Bays ended up receiving the nomination, and Connie Gammon was nominated to be his running mate. Bays also planned to seek the nomination of the Constitution Party. However, Bays resigned from the nomination because it was discovered that he was a neo-Confederate, a view that was deemed too controversial for party members. They later held another nomination process and nominated Connie Gammon for president and Phil Collins as his running mate. However, Gammon later resigned from the nomination due to health concerns, and they held a third nomination convention, this time nominating Phil Collins for president and party activist Billy Joe Parker as his running mate. This ticket appears to be sticking as of the time of the recording of this video. They also received the most votes in the American Independent Party primary, but we'll see if they end up nominating Phil Collins or someone else. And with that, we have reached the most recent developments of the longest existing minor party in US politics. So to all you persistent, pretty conservative prohibitionists, hopefully these 151 years will pay off in the future. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to be notified when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to my website or follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Quora, or check out my articles on the Independent Political Report.